Chapter-3. Garrett, 2 weeks prior. Dr. Garrett Young climbed out of his Ford F-150 truck and stared up at the hospital building. It wasn't his first choice of assignment, but this was where he'd felt God telling him to go, and he wasn't about to pull a Jonah. Besides, the place looked decent. The building appeared to be newer, and there were no signs of dilapidation or obvious needs of repair. It had to be better than the last hospital he'd trained in, where the heater rarely worked, the air conditioner never worked, and the generator kicked on at least once a month due to power loss. As he entered the main floor, he could tell this hospital was busy. Maybe not as busy as some of the bigger places he'd applied for, but the waiting lobbies were half filled. Nurses and orderlies scurried across the room, and the receptionist looked like she never took a break from answering the phone. He had planned to ask her for directions to HR, but as she seemed busy, he figured he could find it himself. Most hospitals had some sort of placard on the wall that said where departments were located. Sure enough, he found one that directed him to the far end of the main floor. He'd completed as much of the paperwork online as he could, but he still needed to sign some things in person and get his badge. "Can I help you?" a woman asked when he stepped into the small HR room. Though her voice was friendly, he could see the tired lines around her eyes and the stress she carried in her shoulder. The nameplate on her desk read Diane Chambers. He smiled at her, trying to commit her name to memory so he could pray for her. It was something he'd started a few months ago, and his first book was nearly full. "I'm Dr. Garrett Young, your new pediatric doctor." "Oh, yes, I was expecting you." She returned his smile and rifled through a few papers on her desk until she found what she was looking for. Then she stood and made her way over to him. "I just need a few signatures from you, and then we'll take a picture and get your badge printed. You didn't have any trouble finding us, did you?" Garrett shook his head. "No troubles at all. Not only did his brother live in town, but he had maps on his phone. It rarely led him astray, although once it had taken him smack dab to a residential area instead of the hamburger place he'd been looking for. He scanned the papers she handed him and signed on the required lines. Then he stepped over to the little camera and let Diane take his picture. A few minutes later, his badge popped out. Not his best picture, but he'd had worse. Though this process was much shorter, it rather reminded him of getting his license at the DMV. "Okay, you're all set. Pediatrics is on the 3rd floor, so just take the elevator up and Yolanda will get you situated upstairs." "Thank you." He headed back through the lobby to the elevators and punched the button to go up. Though there were only 2 elevators, the wait was minimal, and when the doors opened, he stepped inside and punched the button for the 3rd floor. Before the door could close fully, a feminine voice called out, "Hold the elevator, please." Garrett stuck his shoe in front of the door to keep it from closing, but he was unprepared for the woman who entered. Her dark hair was pulled up, but tendrils snaked down the side of her face, and his eyes were instantly drawn to her slender neck. Her skin was pale and creamy like butter, and her eyes were bright blue like the ocean. "Thank you," she said, as the door closed behind her. Her soft, feminine voice sent a shiver down his back. He'd had physical, visceral reactions to women before, but not like this. There was something mesmerizing about this woman. "You're welcome." Why did his voice sound more like a croak than his usual tone? Her eyes grew wide as she really looked at him for the first time. "Are you British?" Garrett recognized the look on her face. It was one he had seen often. the pure look of adoration based solely on the sound of his accent. Normally, he shrugged this off, but this woman was enchanting, so he decided to use it to his advantage. I am. I'm from a tiny village near London originally, but I've been in America for over a decade. I'm surprised my accent is still as strong as it is. Thankfully, he could turn it up when he wanted and dial it back when he needed to make sure kids could understand him. Well, I'm glad it is. I love the sound of the British accent. Her eyes didn't exactly bat at him, but he could tell they were close. Are you visiting someone? I haven't seen you around, and I certainly would remember your voice. Not visiting, no. I'm the new pediatric doctor, Garrett Young. He held out his hand to shake hers, hoping she would take it so he could see if her skin was as soft as it looked. He hadn't been on a date in a while, but he could definitely see himself asking this woman out. You're kidding! Her lips pulled into an even wider smile as she took his hand. I'm Renee Mackey, one of your nurses. We'll get to work together every day. And just like that, his elation rushed from him like a heavy sigh. He didn't date coworkers, and certainly not nurses he'd have to work with every day. At least, not anymore. Carrie hadn't been the reason he'd left Chicago, but she'd certainly played a part. And besides that, he'd seen too many tense moments and almost mistakes from people who dated coworkers and then couldn't handle working with the person when the relationship ended. In an office job, that might not matter, but in a hospital it did, especially when his patients were kids. Oh, that's good news, he said, softening the accent. No reason to lead her on. If she noticed the change, she didn't say anything. I'm glad they hired another doctor. Dr. Collins is great, but it was getting too busy for him to handle alone. It stays busy then? He asked. Most days. The elevator dinged and they both stepped out. A welcome reprieve since she was still looking at him like he'd hung the moon, and he didn't have the heart to tell her it would never work. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other, she said when they reached the nurse's station. She flashed another wide smile and then scurried off, but he couldn't help noticing the slight swaying of her hips as she left. Perhaps it was the way she always walked, but he had the feeling it was done for his benefit. The nurse at the station looked up at him and lifted a brow. I'm guessing you're the new doctor. She was short, probably no more than 5'3" and stout, but everything about this woman screamed that she did not take nonsense. I am, Dr. Garrett Young. Uh-huh. She looked him over and then glanced to where Renee had gone before looking back to him. Well, I'm glad you're here. It seems like you've got a fan already. No surprise there. He didn't know if her words meant she wasn't surprised Renee liked him, or if Renee had shown an interest in previous doctors. What he did know was that she was fishing, and he wasn't going to give her any ammunition. Renee seems very nice, and I'm sure she's a good nurse. She pursed her lips and gave him a face that said she was clearly not convinced, but that wasn't his problem. Though she looked like she was probably in charge, he was the doctor and he didn't need her approval for who he could and couldn't date. All right then, I'm Yolanda, the head nurse up here. If you need anything, I'm your woman. Been here for 10 years, longer than anyone else on this floor, so I know my stuff. He wouldn't have doubted she did, even without her background. There was something in the way she carried herself, a confidence that emanated from her even through her scrubs. Good to know. We've got 3 new pediatric cases, Dr. Young. 9-year-old with a broken arm, a 2-year-old with a high fever, and a teenager complaining of severe abdominal pain. Garrett nodded as he took the charts. He scanned them quickly, his dark brows furrowing in concentration. Though not the hardest part of his job, this was one of the most important aspects. Analyzing who needed care first was much more important when bodies were little, because most things affected them faster, so he had to choose wisely and hopefully be right. A broken arm was generally one that could wait a little longer, though he'd seen one case where the broken bone damaged the surrounding blood vessels and nerves and left the kid with permanent nerve damage. But that was a rare case. The abdominal pain was a little more worrisome, as it could be appendicitis, or it could be something as simple as food poisoning or a 24-hour bug. The fever could be nothing, a cold, a common virus, but it could also be something much more serious. He chose to go with it first due to the patient's age. The child would be of little help, which meant a worried parent was definitely involved. "I'll see the 2-year-old first," he said decisively. He handed back the other charts and headed for room 4, hoping it would turn out to be nothing serious. Garrett entered the exam room where a tiny girl with pigtails lay listlessly on the table, her fretful parents hovering over her. He offered them a reassuring smile. "Hello, I'm Dr. Young. I hear little Nora has a fever." He always tried to use the patient's name when he introduced himself. Though it didn't always work, it often helped the parents relax a little when they realized he'd taken the time to learn it. The mother wrung her hands. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair lay flat on her head as if she hadn't showered in a few days. This family would be going in his journal as well. "She's been running a high fever all day. I gave her some medicine, but after lunch, she was so lethargic that we brought her in. We're terrified it might be something serious." Garrett placed a gentle hand on Nora's forehead, his eyes softening with compassion. "You were right to bring her in. Fevers in small children can be dangerous if left unchecked. But let's not worry before we have all the information." As he asked the parents questions that would help him diagnose the girl, he kept his tone and facial expressions calm. It was something he had mastered, as it helped relax anxious parents as well. With every answer, he ran through possible diagnoses, making a mental note of appropriate tests he might need in order to rule out the worst scenarios. "When was the last time you gave her medicine?" he asked when his evaluation was through. The mother checked her watch. "About 3 hours ago. It was just before lunch." Garrett nodded. "Okay, I can't give her any more for an hour, but I'll make a note for the nurse to bring her some then. My guess is that it's a virus, but I'd like to keep Nora here for observation until the fever breaks, just to be sure." The mother sagged against her husband in relief. "Yes, of course, whatever you need to do to make her okay." It was clear the mother was the one who needed the most comfort, but Garrett knew that wasn't his place. So he placed a hand on the father's shoulder, hoping it would be enough. "Don't worry, we'll take good care of her." The father issued a nod in return, and Garrett left the room with the updated chart in his hand. As he did, he lifted his eyes for just a second. "Lord, please place your healing hand on the girl and give peace to the family." It was all he had time for at the moment, but he knew it would be enough. The Bible said to pray unceasingly, and like the journal, it was something he'd been working on doing the last few months. He handed the chart to Yolanda and grabbed the one for the stomach ache in room 2. But before he could review it, a loud, agonizing scream filled the air. Tucking the chart under his arm, he hurried toward the noise along with Yolanda, Renee, and another nurse who had been nearby. The teenager in room 2 was holding onto his stomach and howling in agony. Garrett swallowed a frustrated breath. He'd clearly chosen incorrectly. "Hey, David, my name is Dr. Young. We're going to take good care of you. Can you tell me where it hurts most?" The boy shook his head, but the placement of his hands told Garrett everything he needed to know. "I'm going to give you a quick examination, but I think you have appendicitis, David. This is going to hurt just a bit." As gently as he could, Garrett examined David's stomach, his suspicions confirmed when he felt the abdominal rigidity. "He needs an OR now," he said to whichever nurse was closest. "On it," one called, and hurried out of the room. Garrett turned to the parents, or parent in this case, a frail woman with a gaunt face who looked as if she hadn't received a decent night's sleep in weeks. If he had to wager, he'd bet he was looking at a single mother working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. "Mrs. Martin, David is going to need emergency surgery. I'll bring in paperwork for you to sign, but can I get your verbal consent?" She leaned forward to place a hand on David's arm before glancing up at him. "It's just Miss Martin now, but yes, you have my permission, whatever he needs." A minute later, the nurse returned with 2 orderlies to wheel David to surgery. And once both mother and child were out of sight, Garrett sagged in relief and ran a hand down his face. "Lord, please let him be okay." "I'm sure he'll be fine." He glanced up to see Renee was still in the room with him. Her emerald green eyes brimmed with compassion, and she looked like she wanted to step closer to him, but she didn't. "I hope so." He shook his head, frustrated at himself for not making the right call. "I should have checked him first to make sure." "You couldn't have known." This time she did take a step closer to him, but she didn't touch him, thankfully. If she had, he might have crumbled. He didn't know her, but he could feel the compassion radiating off her, and right now he could use some. "No, I suppose I couldn't have. But that's not a good excuse when the lives of children are in your hands." He took a deep breath and pulled his shoulders back. He'd had close calls before. Heck, he'd lost kids at his last hospital. But it never got easier, and losing a kid on his first day would haunt him forever. "Speaking of which, I've got a broken arm to check and make sure it's not anything more serious. Thank you for your help." "Of course." She gave him a quick nod, but he could tell she wanted to say more. He returned to the intake desk and grabbed the next chart, hoping that he wasn't wrong about the broken arm as well. It was a few hours later when it finally slowed down enough for Garrett to catch a breath. He sank down on a couch in the staff lounge and closed his eyes. Tomorrow he would remember to bring his Bible with him. Even if he didn't have time to read it, just having it close would bring him comfort. "You doing all right?" He opened his eyes to see Renee standing over him, still looking as beautiful as she had this morning. He wondered how she did it, but then he pushed the thought away. He should push her away as well, but he couldn't deny that it was nice to have someone ask how he was doing. Not only had it been a rough first day, but men were expected to keep their emotions in check and push through it. Still, he should tell her he didn't date coworkers because he could still read the attraction in her eyes. But he didn't have the energy. "Yeah, I'm okay. I see what you mean about it being busy." On one hand, he loved the pace. It not only kept him busy, but it gave him the opportunity to work with and hopefully bless a lot of people. On the other hand, it was exhausting. He couldn't even remember if he'd eaten lunch. "We have slow days, too." She flashed him a crooked grin. "Sometimes." She crossed the few steps separating them and sat next to him. She was close enough that he could smell the soft scent of her, and it made his stomach clench. He loved his job, and he loved serving God, but he was lonely, and he hoped to find love someday. Could Renee fill the hole in his heart? As much as he was trying to fight his attraction to Renee, it appeared he was losing. That's good. He shifted slightly to his right, hoping to put a little more space between them without her noticing. She glanced at him, and a small smile played at the corners of her lips. She'd noticed, but it didn't seem to bother her. "The kids seem to love you. Not that I'm surprised." "Thanks, but I've got to do a better job assessing. Did he—" Garrett paused. He wanted to know if the boy had made it through surgery, but he wasn't sure he'd be okay if Renee told him he hadn't.
"Did David make it?"
Renee nodded and placed a hand on his arm. It was warm and soft, just like he'd imagined it would be, and it made him long for a relationship even more. He definitely missed a woman's touch. He did. You got to him in time. No complications even. No, God was the reason that kid was okay, not him. He'd meant to check up on David that afternoon, but he'd never gotten the chance. It was nice to know he was okay, but it didn't ease the guilt he felt at not looking at the boy first.
"I'm glad."
She removed her hand from his arm, took a deep breath, and pressed her lips together as if deciding if she wanted to say something or keep it to herself. Once a week, a few of us get together for food and drinks. It's our way of decompressing. Would you like to join us?
"I don't really drink."
He had when he'd been in college and his first year of med school, but he'd seen not only how it affected him, but others around him, so he'd given it up. Not entirely. He enjoyed red wine with his dinners on occasion, and every once in a while he would enjoy a cold beer. But those days were few and far between. Besides, it had been such a long day that he worried he wouldn't be able to stop if he started.
"Plus, I've still got a lot of unpacking to do."
She rolled her eyes at his excuses. Come on, Dr. Young. You deserve a little decompression after today. Besides, it would be a good way to meet some of your coworkers. He should say no. He had the feeling that Renee, while a bit of a flirt, might be able to pierce his defenses, especially today. But he didn't want to say no. The idea of going home and unpacking held no appeal, and it would be beneficial to meet more of the hospital staff.
"I'll see what I can do."
The smile she flashed lit up her whole face. Great. Do you know where O'Malley's is?
"Is that the sports bar on Garrison?"
He hadn't had a lot of time to learn the layout of Fire Beach, but he'd learned what was near his apartment and what was near the hospital. That's the one. See you there in half an hour? He checked his watch.
"Yeah, if I get done with paperwork in time."
As he watched her walk out of the room, he hoped he wasn't making a giant mistake.